Mark Dawson's perfect collapsed before sunrise. The morning he came home from a secret night in Manhattan, his wife had already vanished along with every trace of their marriage. Waiting for him on the kitchen counter was a single envelope of divorce papers, evidence of his affair, and the first blow in a war he never saw coming. Mark Dawson's perfect lapsed before sunrise, though he didn't realize it when he stepped out of his Porsche onto the quiet street of his affluent Greenwich neighborhood. To the world, Mark was the kind of man whose success seemed inevitable, polished, disciplined, and always in control. He had spent years crafting that image: the sharp-cut suits, the perfectly timed stock plays, the flawless public persona of a devoted husband and high-powered soul. But control was an illusion, one he clung to with the arrogance of a man who believed consequences were for other people. That belief carried him through countless late nights in Manhattan, through hotel check-ins under fake names, through whispered promises to a woman half his age who mistook his recklessness for power. And it carried him home on the morning his life ended. Long before he understood, he was walking straight into a trap he'd built with his own hands. The sky was still a muted gray-blue when Mark opened the front door. Expecting the warmth of the house he had taken for granted for more than a decade. He expected routine: the faint aroma of dark roast coffee Emma brewed at precisely 7, the soft footsteps of her moving through the kitchen, the familiar sound of the blender she used for her morning smoothie. Everything about their mornings had a rhythm, one he never appreciated because he believed it would always be there. Instead, the moment he crossed the threshold, he was struck by a stillness he wasn't prepared for. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of early morning, it was an absence, a hollowness that hit him in a way no argument, no cold stare, no slammed door ever had. Something was wrong, though at first he tried denying the instinct clawing at his chest. He called for Emma with the casual tone of a man fully expecting a response, but the empty rooms absorbed his voice like a warning. He dropped his keys on the marble counter and scanned the living room, expecting some sign of life, but the house felt abandoned. No steaming mug on the counter. No neatly folded newspaper placed exactly where he liked it. No soft music from the speaker Emma often used to start her day. He walked deeper into the house, his confidence beginning to waver with each unanswered step. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar: the sharp, uncomfortable edge of vulnerability. He tried brushing it off as overreaction, as travel fatigue, as anything except what it truly was: the unraveling of every lie he'd wrapped himself in. When he entered the kitchen, he froze. Sitting alone on the spotless marble island was a thick manila envelope, the kind used for legal documents, positioned so precisely it was impossible to mistake it as accidental. His name was written on the front in Emma's handwriting, steady, elegant, unmistakable. The sight of it sliced through him. Envelopes like that didn't hold birthday cards or love notes, they held endings. Mark stood there for several seconds, staring at his own name as though it belonged to someone else. His mind moved fast, searching for explanations that didn't exist. Maybe Emma had gone to visit her sister in Boston. Maybe something urgent happened. Maybe she had left a note explaining everything. But deep down in the part of him he never allowed to surface, he already knew none of these excuses made sense. Emma wasn't impulsive. She didn't disappear without telling him. She didn't leave cryptic envelopes. If she wanted to confront him about something, she would have done it directly, quietly, respectfully. Unless the situation was far beyond confrontation. Unless she already knew. His stomach tightened, his hands felt suddenly heavy. Had she found something? Had someone told her? Had Avery done something reckless? The questions hammered him with increasing urgency as he reached for the envelope. His fingers hesitated above the seal, trembling in a way that enraged him. Trembling was for men who lacked control, and Mark Dawson refused to be one of them. He tore the envelope open with a forceful motion meant to prove he wasn't afraid, but the moment he saw the first page, his heart punched against his ribs. A divorce petition, his name listed under respondent, Emma's under petitioner. The words looked unreal, like a legal drama he was reading instead of living. But as he flipped through the pages, reality struck harder with every sentence. She wasn't asking questions. She wasn't expressing hurt. She was taking action, swift, calculated, devastating action, and she wasn't alone. Stapled behind the petition were photographs, high resolution, professionally taken, time-stamped. Him entering the Four Seasons with Avery. Him kissing Avery in the back of a black SUV. Him checking into a suit under a Shell company credit line he thought no one would ever trace. The angles, the clarity, the precision, this wasn't the work of an amateur. Emma had hired someone. Emma had been watching. Emma had known. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt. He had underestimated her, not just slightly but catastrophically. Mark staggered backward until his spine pressed against the refrigerator door. His throat felt thick, his pulse ragged. For the first time since he'd started cheating, the consequences were real, sharp, unavoidable. He'd always believed he was untouchable, that as long as he kept the finances clean enough and maintained the fi-aid at home, no one could undo him. But the man staring at the documents in his hands was not untouchable. He was cornered. Every snapshot was proof. Every line in the petition was a blade, and yet, despite the shock, his mind clung desperately to denial. He told himself Emma was overreacting, that he could fix this, that with enough charm or manipulation or carefully chosen words, she would reconsider. But the envelope itself contradicted that fantasy. The woman he had dismissed for years as gentle and predictable had struck first with surgical precision. And the eerie stillness of the house, the missing warmth, the missing presence proved she was done waiting for explanations or apologies. He wasn't facing a conversation, he was facing consequences. And they had already begun long before he realized he had walked into the ruins of his own life. Mark's footsteps echoed through the foyer as he forced himself deeper into the house, clinging to the fragile hope that Emma's absence was temporary, that there was some logical explanation he just hadn't reached yet. But every room he passed undercut that hope a little more. The dining table was spotless, chairs tucked in perfectly, not a single misplaced item to suggest morning routines ever happened here. Normally Emma left a half-read novel on the end table or a folded throw blanket draped across the couch. Small marks of a person who actually lived in the home. But now the living room looked staged, like something curated for a real estate showing rather than a space belonging to a married couple. The feeling tightening in his chest refused to leave, like a warning he kept trying to swat away. He walked from room to room with a growing sense that he wasn't uncovering answers, he was confirming them. The kitchen nagged at him most, not because it was empty, but because it was too perfect. Emma was meticulous, yes, but kitchens held life: a drying dish towel, yesterday's grocery list, a fruit bowl slightly askew. Yet this one looked like no one had touched it in days. The stainless steel appliances gleamed as if freshly polished. The counters had that sterile sheen restaurant kitchens have after a deep clean. Even the sink, usually housing a mug or two Emma rinsed but hadn't fully washed, was bone dry. He swallowed hard. She didn't just leave. She prepared to leave. That distinction struck him harder than anything else. People in distress grabbed a suitcase and stormed out. People planning an exit wiped down countertops, emptied fridges, and cleared cabinets. Trying to dismiss the rising dread, Mark headed toward the den, flipping on light switches even though he knew the sun had already begun to seep through the windows. He wasn't searching for Emma anymore, he was searching for something familiar to tether himself to. But the den betrayed him too. The framed photographs that usually lined the sideboard, their wedding picture in San Diego, a trip they took to Aspen, a portrait Emma's sister had gifted them, were gone. All that remained were faint outlines on the walls, rectangles of slightly brighter paint proving they once existed. Even the decorative shelves Emma curated with travel souvenirs were stripped bare. His breath hitched. It was no longer possible to pretend this was accidental. This was a purge. Emma had removed herself piece by piece, quietly dismantling the life he assumed would stay intact forever. He moved quickly now, driven by adrenaline and an ache of disbelief. He checked the laundry room, empty. The guest room, immaculate. He opened the hall closet, usually overflowing with Emma's scarves, jackets and toto bags, and found nothing but hangers, clinking lightly against the metal bar as if mocking him. He slammed the door harder than necessary, the sound bouncing back at him. If she had truly left, she hadn't taken a few essentials. She had taken everything that belonged to her, every trace, every object, every memory. As he stalked down the hallway, he yanked his phone from his pocket and called her. Straight to voicemail. He called again, voicemail. The automated greeting in her calm, warm voice rattled him more than the empty house. He tried her location-sharing app. A blank screen flashed the message, location unavailable. She had turned it off. Emma, the woman who always kept it on for safety, had shut him out completely. A cold ripple slid down his spine as he climbed the stairs, two at a time, toward the master bedroom. His breathing grew uneven. He already knew what he'd find, but denial kept him moving. The bedroom door was open, and the moment he stepped inside, the final confirmation hit him like a blow to the sternum. The entire left side of the walk-in closet Emma's side was stripped bare. The wooden rods, usually weighed down by well-organized outfits, were empty. The shelves where she kept her handbags were vacant. Even the velvet hangers she favored were gone. Her jewelry box was missing from the vanity. A faint outline remained where her perfume tray used to sit. Only Mark's belongings remained untouched, sitting arrogantly on his side of the closet like relics from a life that didn't exist anymore. He leaned forward, gripping the doorframe to steady himself. All the pieces were beginning to line up in a way he couldn't ignore: the untouched kitchen, the empty shelves, the vanishing personal effects. Emma had executed a full extraction. She hadn't left an anger. She had moved with strategy and purpose. That realization hit harder than any accusation could have. He wasn't dealing with a crying spouse seeking explanations. He was dealing with someone who had already made a decision, executed it, and left nothing behind for him to negotiate with. He finally forced himself to sit on the edge of the bed, but even that offered no comfort. The sheets were tucked tightly, the pillows stacked with hotel precision. Not a wrinkle, not a strand of hair, not a sign she had slept there last night. It was almost as if she hadn't lived here for days. How long had she been planning this? How long had she known? How much had she uncovered? His mind spiraled with questions he wasn't ready to confront. He stood abruptly and scanned the room again, seeking her laptop, her planner, anything she might have missed in her sweeping exit. Nothing. But then something on her nightstand caught his eye. The surface was bare except for two items: her wedding ring and a heavy manila envelope. The ring gleamed under the early morning light, a symbol that once held meaning but now felt like a final statement. He picked it up and felt its weight: light, cold, final. He set it back down and reached for the envelope instead, dread settling deep in his gut. Seeing it downstairs was one thing. Holding it was another. It felt heavier than it should be, and he knew without even opening that whatever was inside would shatter whatever denial he had left. Before he even tore the seal, his thoughts bounced back to the night before: the hotel suite at the Four Seasons, the overpriced room service. Avery laughing as she teased him about how easily he lied to Emma. He remembered Avery sprawled across the king-size bed, her red dress pooling on the floor like a challenge to the life he pretended to lead. At the time it all felt thrilling, controlled, manageable. He believed he had mastered the art of balancing two worlds: the stable marriage and the reckless affair. But as he stood in the hollowed-out space Emma once called home, that illusion began to dissolve. His double life had collided, and the crash was far louder than he ever anticipated. Avery was an escape, a distraction. Emma was the foundation he treated as though it was indestructible. But everything about this morning proved just how wrong he'd been. Foundations crumble too, especially when someone quietly removes the support beams without warning. Mark forced himself to stop pacing and finally opened the envelope, fully bracing for whatever was waiting inside. But in that single suspended moment before he saw the contents, he felt something unexpected: not anger, not guilt, but fear. The kind that coils low in the gut when a man realizes the consequences he thought he could outrun have caught up to him. The house around him didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like a tomb, namely, the burial site of the life he took for granted. He wished, absurdly, for Emma to walk in, to be standing in the doorway with some explanation that could reverse everything unraveling around him. But the truth was already carved into the emptiness of the home. She was gone, because she no longer wanted to share a life with him. And the envelope in his hands wasn't a question, it was her answer. Mark ripped open the manila envelope with a mixture of dread and denial twisting in his gut. But nothing could have prepared him for the cold precision of what waited inside. The first page was a formal divorce filing, stamped by the Superior Court of Connecticut. His name printed beneath respondent in a font that somehow felt accusatory. The elegant signature at the bottom, Emma Winthrop Dawson, might as well have been carved in stone. Mark blinked hard, telling himself he was misreading something, that the document was incomplete, that Emma couldn't possibly mean this. She was steady, predictable, compassionate to a fault. She wasn't the type to file for divorce without so much as a conversation. Yet the ink was real, the stamp was real, and the crisp edges of the paper suggested the attorney who prepared it had done so with absolute confidence in the outcome. He flipped the page, heart pounding, and what came next shattered whatever remnants of denial he'd clung to. Dozens of high-resolution photos spilled into his lap, not grainy phone snapshots, not amateur surveillance shots. These were the kind of images professional investigators captured with long lenses and perfect timing. There he was, stepping out of the Four Seasons with Avery, his hand on her lower back. There he was at a rooftop bar in Manhattan, leaning in to kiss her. There he was entering Avery's apartment building late at night. The timestamps were meticulous: dates, times, GPS coordinates, each one a nail in the coffin of his marriage. Mark's throat tightened as he lifted one of the photos closer. He remembered that night clearly. Avery had teased him for choosing such an expensive hotel, joking that he must have money to burn. At the time, he'd laughed it off and told her not to worry about it. Emma never checked the credit card statements that weren't tied to the household. What he didn't know was that Emma had been quietly unraveling every thread he thought he'd hidden, pulling them apart with a patience he never credited her with. He flipped through the stack with increasing desperation, hoping for some anomaly he could grasp onto, a misidentification, a blurry face, anything that would let him deny the reality closing in. But each photograph was unmistakably him, caught in moments of carelessness and arrogance. In one, he held Avery's hand as they walked through Central Park. In another, he leaned across a dinner table at a trendy Soho restaurant, the candlelight illuminating a smile he hadn't worn at home in years. Seeing himself through the lens of someone tracking him felt unsettling, almost surreal. He'd always considered his infidelity a private part of his life, compartmentalized, controlled, insulated from the world Emma lived in. Now, staring at this glossy collection of his own betrayal, he saw how naive that belief had been. He wasn't a man balancing two worlds. He was a man being watched, studied, documented. And Emma had let him continue thinking he was untouchable. At the bottom of the first stack was a neatly clipped set of pages with a letterhead that made his stomach drop. Harrington and Lowe, Lupp Family Law Division, a New York firm known for handling high-asset divorces with lethal efficiency. The kind of attorneys billionaires used when they wanted to crush an opponent without leaving fingerprints. The letter explained in calm, professional language that Emma had retained full representation, that evidence of marital misconduct had been secured, and that the firm would proceed with the division of assets according to the terms of the prenuptial agreement signed 11 years earlier. Mark felt heat flood his face as he read the words marital misconduct. He'd written that clause off as a formality when they got married, a technical provision her family inserted to protect her inheritance. He remembered skimming past it, thinking he'd never need to worry about it. But the pages laid out the consequences with brutal clarity. If he was found guilty of infidelity, all marital assets acquired during the marriage would revert to Emma, the house, the investments, the cars purchased after they wed, even his vested shares in the company, everything. He threw the papers onto the bed and ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth across the room. This had to be a mistake. Emma wasn't ruthless, she wasn't calculating. She spent her days volunteering at the local literacy center, attending board meetings for arts charities and managing fundraising galas. She wasn't someone who hired elite lawyers or surveillance teams, except she had. Every assumption he ever built about who she was now felt shaky, unreliable. Had she always been capable of this level of strategy? Or had he pushed her into becoming someone he no longer recognized? The questions tangled in his mind, but every time he reached for an answer, his gaze drifted back to the pile of evidence on the bed. If Emma had taken this step, she hadn't done it impulsively. She had planned, carefully, quietly, thoroughly. When he returned to the bed and forced himself to gather the remaining documents, he found an even thicker bundle underneath a forensic audit report, neatly bound and annotated in red ink. His pulse thrashed against his throat as he skimmed the summary: unauthorized expenditures, misallocated corporate funds, personal travel disguised as business trips, jewelry purchased under vendor accounts, housing stipends redirected. Every trick he'd used to hide his spending on Avery was outlined, documented, and cross-referenced with financial codes he thought no one else paid attention to. Someone had combed through months of statements and caught entries he believed he'd burrowed deep enough to avoid detection. Seeing the numbers laid out so plainly stirred something between rage and disbelief. How had she done this? How had she gained access to accounts he controlled? How had she found the paper trails he covered so meticulously? But as he stared at the red annotations, another realization surfaced: Emma was a Winthrop. Her family owned half the financial infrastructure in the Northeast. She had access to accountants, investigators, and experts who operated far beyond his skill level. He wasn't fighting a suspicious spouse. He was fighting an empire. There was more. A final letter, this one from Emma herself, typed on simple white stationery rather than an attorney's letterhead. He hesitated before reading it, expecting anger, heartbreak, accusations, something emotional he could latch onto, something human to counterbalance the clinical brutality of the documents. But the letter was short, direct, and devastatingly calm. She wrote that she had known about the affair for months. She wrote that she had tried to understand how the man she married had become someone she no longer recognized. She wrote that she chose not to confront him sooner, because confrontation would have only opened the door to lies he was already comfortable telling. Instead, she spent her time preparing an exit that protected her future, her sanity, and her dignity. No threats, no pleas, no emotional outbursts. Just a clear statement of boundaries and consequences. The kind of letter written by someone who had already detached long before the paperwork was filed. By the time he finished reading, Mark felt the weight of the envelope settle over him like a verdict. Everything he believed he controlled had slipped from his grip. The life he built wasn't collapsing, it had already collapsed long before he set foot in the house. Emma had simply revealed the ruins. As he stood in the bedroom holding the documents, a heavy realization washed over him. He had never really understood the woman he married. He had mistaken her kindness for complacency, her quiet nature for naivete, her loyalty for dependence. But the evidence before him told a different story. Emma had been watching, calculating, preparing not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted freedom. And now she had taken it, leaving him with nothing but the consequences he crafted himself. He looked around the room once more, hoping to spot something she'd forgotten. Something that would anchor him to the idea that all of this could still be undone. But the space remained painfully empty. Emma had left him nothing to hold on to, not even a reason to argue. Just the truth, laid bare in legal paper and photographs. And the truth was enough to dismantle every illusion he had ever lived in. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he snatched his phone from the nightstand, desperate for some foothold in the avalanche swallowing him whole. There was only one person who might offer an explanation, one person who could tell him this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He dialed the number of David Harlow, his business partner and co-founder of Dawson and Harlow, someone who had known him since their early days as ambitious MBA grads who believed they were destined to conquer Wall Street. Mark expected confusion, annoyance, maybe even concern from the other end of the call. He expected a friend. Instead, David answered with the kind of voice used in boardrooms when delivering bad news to a hostile investor. Controlled, cautious, detached. The first words out of David's mouth made Mark's stomach drop. "Mark, you need to check your email." Hearing that tone from someone who'd once toasted with him after their first $1 million contract rattled him. "What are you talking about?" Mark snapped, pacing across the bedroom carpet. "Emma's gone, she's filed some ridiculous divorce petition, and now I need," but David cut him off. Something he'd never dared to do before. "This isn't about the divorce, this is about the company." Mark stopped moving, cold pressing against his spine. "What company?" "My company." His voice cracked in a way he hated. David exhaled, not in frustration but in the resigned way doctors do before breaking terrible news. "You are not understanding what's happening. The board held an emergency meeting this morning, at 5. The number hit him like a sucker punch. 5 in the morning, the same hour Emma was executing her exit. "I wasn't told about any meeting," Mark barked, though he knew that was the point. "Why wasn't I notified?" A pause stretched on the line, not hesitation, fear. "Because it wasn't a meeting you were meant to be part of," David finally said. Emma's attorney presented the findings from the audit. The board voted unanimously. "You've been removed as FO effective immediately." Mark felt heat erupt across his face. Removed on what grounds? But David didn't flinch. Financial misconduct. Misappropriation of corporate funds, ethical violations. The legal phrasing made Mark's heart seize. Every misfiled expense report, every business dinner with Avery, every retreat disguised as client development. Emma had delivered it all on a silver platter to the board. "This is insane," Mark spat. "You and I built this company. You know damn well I kept it running." "She doesn't know the first thing about our operations." David's next sentence shattered the last illusion Mark clung to. "Mark M owns 52% of the voting stock." Everything inside him froze. At first he thought he'd misheard. "She owns what?" The words scraped out of his throat like gravel. David repeated it slowly, as though speaking to someone in shock. "She's the majority shareholder." Mark laughed, a choked, humorless sound. "That's impossible. She inherited nothing but a few old paintings and a dusty trust fund. Her dad was a museum archivist. Her mom was a school teacher." But David didn't let him finish. "Her mother's maiden name was Winthrop." The world tilted. Mark gripped the edge of the bed to steady himself. "Winthrop as in Winthrop Holdings," David confirmed. "As in one of the oldest private banking dynasties in the country. As in one of the founding families of New England finance." He spoke like he couldn't believe Mark had never bothered to learn what he should have known all along. Her mother's side controls significant assets in 4 states. Her cousin sits on the board of a Federal Reserve Bank. Mark felt his mouth go dry. He thought Emma was simply understated, modest, uninterested in flashy wealth. He never once imagined she had chosen that posture intentionally. His mind raced back to when they first met. She wore thrifted cardigans, lived in a small Boston apartment, and spoke with the gentle confidence of someone who didn't care about status. When he proposed, she didn't request a large ring or a lavish ceremony. She let him make every decision, even signed the prenup without argument. He thought she was grateful to marry into success. In reality, she was protecting her own empire. David's voice broke through the haze. "When we founded the company, where did you think the initial $7 million in seed money came from?" That question sliced through him with surgical precision. He had never questioned the anonymous investment routed through a Cayman fund. He simply assumed it was a strategic backer who wanted privacy. But the way David said it told him everything. "She funded us," Mark whispered, horrified. "She was the angel investor. She believed in you," David said quietly. "She believed in us. But after what surfaced, she doesn't believe anymore." Mark pressed a hand against his forehead as the weight of his own stupidity bore down on him. How had he missed this? How had he never questioned where their early lifeline came from? The house in Greenwich, the stock grants, the expansion that saved the company during the recession, it was all possible because Emma had backed him. And he rewarded her by cheating, diverting funds, and treating her like an afterthought. "This is a nightmare," he muttered. "You can fix this. Talk to the board, they'll listen to me, they have to." But David didn't agree, they won't. The finality in his tone was sharper than any accusation. Emma's in control now, and the audit was thorough. "There's no defending what you did," Mark's anger flared. "So you re-choosing her side, after all we built?" "I'm choosing survival," David replied. Emma came prepared with legal, financial, and compliance teams. She's already taken steps to protect the company from liability. That means distancing from the person who caused the liability, you. Mark wanted to scream, to throw the phone, to deny everything, but reality kept tightening its grip. "So what happens now?" he asked, though part of him didn't want the answer. "Security has been instructed not to allow you into the building," David said. "Your corporate accounts, access badges, and communication privileges were deactivated an hour ago. You should also know Emma has initiated a formal complaint with the ears regarding financial irregularities. The company is cooperating fully." Mark's knees nearly buckled. She reported the offshore accounts. His voice cracked under the enormity of the situation. David hesitated, then delivered the final blow. She didn't just report them, she revealed them proactively. She framed it as internal reform after uncovering misconduct. "The narrative is already public. You re the scapegoat, Mark. And honestly, she has the evidence to back it up." The phone slipped from Mark's hand and hit the carpet. The call still faintly active as David's voice carried through the speaker. He couldn't process the words anymore. Every safeguard he built, every secret account, every misfiled expense, every lie he crafted had collapsed under the weight of Emma's preparation. She hadn't reacted, she had orchestrated. He wasn't dealing with a heartbroken wife. He was dealing with a strategist from one of the most powerful financial bloodlines in the country. A woman who had given him every opportunity to be a partner and watched him squander it on vanity and arrogance. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the documents spread around him like debris after an explosion, and realized the truth that hollowed him out completely. He had not just lost his marriage. He had lost his company, his fortune, his power, and the identity he built his entire life upon. And the worst part, Emma hadn't done it out of vengeance. She simply removed what was compromising her future. Mark had always believed money was the one thing he could rely on, his fallback, his shield, his escape hatch. Even now, standing in the wreckage of his marriage and career, he convinced himself he still had options. If Emma wanted war, he could hire the best attorneys in New York, throw millions at the problem, bury her team in motions and counter motions until she backed down or slipped up. Money solved everything, money always did. With that thought offering false comfort, he grabbed his wallet and pulled out the sleek black American Express card he treated like a trophy. It had no limit, no restrictions, no questions asked. The concierge service alone cost more annually than most people made in 6 months. Mark gripped it like a lifeline, certain it would put him back in control. He dialed the number on the back, rehearsing a calm, confident tone. Once he got a first-class ticket to Zurich or Vancouver or anywhere far enough away, he could breathe, regroup, find a new strategy. But when the representative answered, the conversation veered off script almost immediately. "Mr. Dawson, I'm unable to process that transaction," the concierge said after he requested the last-minute international flight. Her tone wasn't apologetic, it was cautious, as though she was bracing for his reaction. Mark frowned. That card had never been declined, never been questioned. "Unable. Why? Just book the ticket." More tapping on a keyboard, more hesitation. "So your account has been temporarily suspended." The words hit him like a bucket of ice dumped over his skull. "Suspended for what?" he demanded. "If this is a fraud alert, lift it. I'm telling you to approve the charges." But the concierge didn't budge. "This isn't a fraud flag, Mr. Dawson. We received a court order early this morning freezing all credit lines associated with the Dawson marital estate. All cards linked to you are currently inactive." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "A court order, Emma." She froze his accounts before he even woke up. The timing was too clean, too precise, too coordinated to be anything else. She hadn't reacted to his betrayal, she'd executed a meticulously planned financial takedown. and he'd been so blind he never felt the ground shifting beneath him. He ended the call abruptly, tossing the phone onto the bed with enough force to make it bounce. Panic swelled inside him, raw and suffocating. He tore open his briefcase, searching for the emergency cash he kept there, but the hidden zipper pouch was empty, cleaned out. He sprinted to the home office, yanked open drawers, rifled through files, checking every stash spot he'd ever used. Nothing. Not even a stray 20. Emma had stripped the house of her belongings, but she hadn't stopped there. She stripped it of his escape routes. He ran to the walk-in closet, opened the safe built into the back wall, and punched in the combination he'd used for years. The electronic lock beeped, the door popped open, and his worst fear confirmed itself: empty. Completely empty except for a single sticky note with 8 words written in Emma's neat handwriting: "Your passport is with your attorney. E." Mark stared at the note, feeling the edges cut into his fingertips. She hadn't just controlled the financial landscape, she had walled off every exit like a general preparing for siege warfare. She moved with foresight he never credited her with, shutting down his mobility, his liquidity, his safety nets. Everything he used to manipulate or escape consequences had been preemptively neutralized. How long had she been planning this? Months longer. The thought hit him with brutal force. She didn't leave him. She dismantled him. By the time he realized it, the damage was already complete. Still grasping at denial, Mark rushed downstairs, grabbed his phone, and attempted to transfer funds from his private brokerage account, the one Emma didn't know about, or so he believed. But when he opened the app, a red error message filled the screen: access restricted. Account frozen under marital asset injunction. She found that one too, the offshore accounts also restricted, the shell company card deactivated. He even attempted to initiate a wire transfer from a dormant savings account he'd opened in college. But the bank flagged it as part of the same freeze order. Everywhere he turned, every avenue he relied on, Emma had cut off with clinical precision. He wasn't just cornered, he was financially paralyzed. For the first time in his adult life, Mark Dawson didn't have money. Not access to money, not control over money. Not leverage created by money, nothing. All he had was $200 in cash and the illusion of power that was evaporating with every failed transaction. His breathing grew erratic as he stumbled back into the kitchen, gripping the counter for support. He never imagined Emma capable of this. He'd seen her as soft, agreeable, conflict-averse. The kind of woman who apologized for things that weren't her fault. The kind of woman he thought could be lied to, managed, kept in the dark. But this version of Emma, strategic, calculated, relentless, was someone entirely different. Someone he clearly never understood. Someone who understood him far better than he realized. As panic pushed him forward, he tried calling her again, hoping absurdly that she'd answer, that there was still a conversation to be had. That maybe she'd gone too far and could be talked down. But again the call went straight to voicemail. Not even a ring, she blocked him. He felt a wave of anger surge through him, a last desperate attempt to regain footing. How dare she blindside him like this? How dare she freeze assets he worked for? How dare she treat him like a criminal? But the moment he looked at the envelope, still open on the bed upstairs, the anger wavered. She didn't treat him like a criminal. The evidence showed he was one. He grabbed his phone once more and attempted to call a lawyer, a high-powered litigator known for representing executives in scandal. But when he reached the firm's receptionist, she informed him politely that due to a conflict of interest, they could not take his case. Another firm said the same, then another, then another. By the 5th rejection, the truth hit him: Emma had contacted them first. Her legal team had swept the city, blocking him from retaining the kind of representation he'd need to counter her. He was legally outmaneuvered before he even picked up the phone. His chest tightened again as he considered what this meant. Without money, without access to counsel, without assets, and without mobility, he had no leverage. Emma held every card. And the frightening part wasn't just that she held them, it was that she anticipated every move he might try to make. She wasn't playing defense, she was dominating the entire board. Mark staggered to the living room window and stared out at the quiet streets of Greenwich, the manicured lawns, the perfect houses with their perfect facades. For the first time, he wasn't part of that world. He was trapped in a shell of a life he no longer controlled, no longer belonged to. Everything was unraveling, the foundations he built, the identity he crafted, the freedom he relied upon, all reduced to dust in a single morning. And all because he misjudged the woman he married. He thought she would break. He thought she would cry. He thought she would cling. Instead, she planned, prepared, executed, and cut him off at the knees without raising her voice once. A quiet woman with generational wealth and family lawyers wasn't weak, she was untouchable. He, on the other hand, was nothing more than a man who thought he could outrun consequences he created. The envelope upstairs had been the first blow. Losing access to his money was the second. And Mark was beginning to understand something terrifying. The worst was still coming. Mark's panic sharpened into a frantic sort of determination as he grabbed his overnight bag and stumbled toward the front door. If the house was gone, the accounts were gone, the company was gone. He still had one person he believed would stand with him: Avery. Avery adored him. Avery relied on him. Avery whispered that she would follow him anywhere. He'd been her mentor, her secret, her ticket out of a dull entry-level job. She had clung to him like he was the center of her world. And Mark, with all his arrogant confidence, believed she would be his shelter now that his world was collapsing. He immediately dialed her number as he walked down the driveway, bag dragging against the pavement. When she picked up on the second ring, her voice was laced with annoyance rather than concern. "Mark, why are you calling me? Weren't you supposed to be home pretending to be the perfect husband?" Her tone made his jaw tighten. "Avery, listen," he said sharply, fighting to steady his voice. "Emma knows everything. I came home and the house is empty. She's filed for divorce. She's pulled financial records. She presented evidence to the board." He expected a gasp, a whisper of sympathy, something. Instead, Avery sounded entertained, almost amused. "So what, you re-single now? Isn't that what you said you wanted?" Mark swallowed hard. "Avery, this is serious. She froze my accounts. She took control of the company. I need a place to stay for a day or two." "I'm coming over." Silence met his words, thick, weighted, and dangerous. Then she exhaled slowly. "Mark, my place is small, like really small." He grit his teeth. "It's temporary, just for a night or two." But Avery pressed on, her tone shifting, losing its flirtatious warmth and gaining a sharp, defensive edge. "Look, things are crazy at the office today. Everyone's talking." Her sent out a company-wide memo. Mark stopped walking. His heartbeat hammered hard enough to blur his vision. "What memo?" he asked, voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. Papers rustled as she read it aloud. "Effective immediately, Mark Dawson has been removed from his position due to violations of company policy and financial misconduct. Employees are advised not to communicate with him during the ongoing investigation." Mark's breath stuttered. The betrayal burned deep, not because the company sent it, but because Avery sounded like she was reading about a stranger rather than the man she'd slept beside hours earlier. "Avery," he started, but she didn't let him finish. "Mark, did you put my apartment rent on a corporate card?" The question cracked like a whip. He winced. "It was disguised as a housing stipend for junior employee retention," he admitted, hoping honesty would calm her. It didn't. Her voice spiked with panic. "Oh my God, Mark, they could come after me for that!" "I didn't ask you to do that. I didn't sign anything. I didn't approve anything." Avery calmed down, he insisted, though his own pulse was spiraling. We handle it. I'll handle it." But she wasn't listening. Fear was consuming her, her words tumbling faster with every breath. "They were going to audit everything, my emails, my expenses, my text messages." "I'm not going down with you, going down with me," Mark repeated, stunned. "Avery, we in this together." That was the wrong thing to say. She laughed, sharp, bitter, almost cruel. "No, Mark, you in this. I was in it as long as it was fun and glamorous and beneficial. I didn't sign up to visit you in prison. And I definitely didn't sign up to lose my job, because you couldn't keep your marriage together." Her words hit harder than the divorce papers. Mark's voice cracked with disbelief. "Avery, I have nobody else right now. I need you." But she had already withdrawn. He could hear it in the shift of her breathing, the measured tone of self-preservation replacing whatever fantasy she'd shared with him before. "Don't come here," she said sharply. "If you show up at my apartment, I will call the police. I'm serious." Mark felt the bottom drop out from under him. "Avery, please." But the line went dead. She hung up on him. He stared at his phone, the black screen reflecting a man who didn't look powerful anymore. His hair was disheveled, his eyes darted like a cornered animal, and the confidence he once strutted with had evaporated. Avery was gone. Just like the company, just like the house, just like Emma. He had burned down the life he built, and the woman he'd thrown it away for couldn't even spare him a couch. Mark stood frozen in his driveway, clutching his dead phone, realizing with a horrifying clarity that he had overestimated his influence at every turn. Avery hadn't loved him, she'd loved the lifestyle he provided, the thrill of dating a powerful executive, the perks that came with being wrapped around his lies. But the moment the perks evaporated, so did she. There was no loyalty, no emotion, not even pity. He wasn't her lover. He was a liability, and she severed him like one. He tried to convince himself she would call back, that she'd reconsider after her panic passed, but the truth punched him harder each second. Avery wasn't coming, no one was. Mark was alone, truly alone. The weight of that realization settled onto his chest like a steel beam, making it hard to breathe. The world he built, the world he thought he controlled, was collapsing in real time. And the one person he thought would choose him instead chose survival. It was a brutal mirror held to his face. He'd spent years treating people like assets, tools, stepping stones. And now he was the one being discarded for the same reasons he once used to justify discarding others. He lowered himself onto the stone steps of the porch, head in his hands, trying to process the avalanche of loss. Moments earlier, he had believed he could manipulate his way out of this. Now he couldn't even get a ride across town. A man who once negotiated million-dollar deals and gave keynote speeches to rooms full of executives couldn't convince a 24-year-old assistant to open her door to him. The humiliation settled deep, nestling into every corner of him with a toxic burn. He replayed the conversation with Avery over and over, searching for some version where she might stand by him. But every path led to the same brutal conclusion: he had never meant anything to her. Not really. He was a convenience, a thrill, a stepping stone, a fantasy, and fantasies dissolve the moment reality intrudes. His chest tightened again. Emma had removed him from her life with strategy. Avery removed him with survival instinct. Both in ways that revealed just how insignificant he truly was. A gust of wind rustled through the neighborhood, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant traffic, grounding him in the present. He had no money, no support, no allies, no transportation. And now, no illusion that the woman he ruined his life for cared enough to even let him hide on her couch. The loneliness pressed in, cold and suffocating, but beneath it simmered something else: shame. Not just for what he'd done, but for how completely he'd miscalculated every relationship in his life. He wasn't the smart one. He wasn't the strategist. He wasn't the one pulling strings. He was the one tangled in them. Avery's rejection wasn't the deepest cut, but it was the one that finally made him understand the truth. He hadn't simply lost everything. He had never truly owned any of it in the first place. Mark wiped his face with trembling hands and forced himself back to his feet. Every instinct in him screamed to get away, to move, to run, to find somewhere, anywhere. That wasn't this house now stripped of its meaning. He told himself he didn't need Avery. He didn't need Emma. He didn't need the company. He just needed to get to the city, regroup, disappear until he could figure out his next move. His Porsche Panamera sat in the driveway like a final lifeline, black and sleek and powerful, a machine he trusted more than any person. He hurried toward it, gripping his overnight bag as if the thin leather could anchor him. The morning air was crisp, the quiet suburban street unchanged despite the implosion of his life. For a fleeting moment, the sight of the car gave him a flicker of confidence. This, at least, was still his. He pressed the key fob, heard the locks click, and slid into the driver's seat. The familiarity of the leather, the subtle scent of cologne embedded in the upholstery, all of it soothed him in a way nothing else had. This was control, this was forward motion, this was escape. He jammed his thumb against the start button. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then choked into stillness. He frowned and pressed it again. Another sputter, a clicking noise, no ignition. No roar, no salvation. He pressed the button harder, as though force alone could will the vehicle to life. Instead, the dashboard lit up with a message he had never seen in all his years of driving luxury cars: remote immobilization active. Contact dealer. The words glowed in unforgiving red, burning deeper with every passing second. Mark stared at them, uncomprehending at first. Remote immobilization. That feature wasn't supposed to be used without owner authorization. He pressed the button again, each attempt more frantic than the last, but the engine remained dead. The car ignored him completely. His breath came shallow as the truth began to claw its way into his mind. The Porsche wasn't fully his. It was leased under a company fleet program controlled by the majority shareholder, Emma. She had bricked his car. She had turned off his accounts, emptied his safe, frozen his assets, and now she had shut down his ability to leave. The realization hit him with physical force. She didn't want him regrouping. She didn't want him reaching a lawyer. She didn't want him disappearing. She wanted him stuck, contained, accessible for whatever came next. Panic roared through him as he slammed his palms against the steering wheel. "No, no, no!" he shouted through clenched teeth. He felt the humiliation burn through his entire body. Emma had used a corporate fleet function on him like he was a delinquent employee behind on payments. He struck the wheel again, the impact jarring his wrists. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered now except the crushing fact that every path he tried to take, she had closed before he even stepped onto it. He had always believed she played small, that she avoided conflict, that she preferred to stay in the background. But no woman in the background could orchestrate something this clean, this coordinated, this total. He stumbled out of the car, the door thudding shut behind him. A hollow dizziness washed over him as he looked up and down the quiet street. The manicured lawns, the trimmed hedges, the polished facades, they all seemed to mock him now. This world once recognized him, respected him, catered to him. Now it looked at him differently, like a man losing his place. Like someone who no longer belonged. He leaned against the portage, his legs shaky. He had no transportation, no money, no partner, no mistress, no support system. He was in the wealthiest suburb on the East Coast, trapped like a criminal on house arrest without the benefit of a legal warning. He sucked in a breath and forced himself back into motion. There had to be another car. Maybe he could call a ride share, except his phone battery was low, and even if he managed to get a ride, he had no functional cards to pay with. He could try walking to the train station miles away, but what then? Buy a ticket with what? His $20 bills left over from last night's valet tip. He felt the walls closing around him even without walls present. He wasn't imprisoned by bars, he was imprisoned by strategy. Emma's strategy. She had executed a digital and financial lockdown with more precision than any foe he'd ever worked with. She cut off his liquidity, his mobility, and his credibility all within a single coordinated morning. He had always considered himself the mastermind. But now, staring at the unresponsive luxury vehicle that was supposed to symbolize power, he understood he had never been the strategist in his own household. He had been the liability. A sudden burst of anger surged in him. This was too much, too calculated, too cruel. He grabbed his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and began marching down the driveway, refusing to remain cornered. His Italian loafers crunched against the gravel with each furious step. He didn't know where he was going, but staying was not an option. As he reached the street, his phone chimed weakly. 1% battery, 1 bar of signal. He had seconds. He dialed the only number left that might offer him help. But Avery didn't pick up. Of course she didn't. Why would she? He was no longer useful to her. The call dropped just as the screen went black. The final thread tethering him to his former life snapped with it. He stood in the middle of Blackwater Lane, breathing hard, surrounded by beautiful houses belonging to people who would pretend not to see him if they drove past. He had never felt so out of place, so stripped of status, so reduced. But he kept walking. He didn't know where he'd end up. He didn't know how he'd get there. All he knew was that the world he built and the woman he thought he controlled had caved in entirely. And Emma Winthrop Dawson, the woman he dismissed as small and fragile, had bricked his life just as easily as she bricked his car. The message on the dashboard might as well have been written across his entire existence, immobilized. Not by a machine, by his wife. And this was only the beginning. Mark's legs carried him down Blackwater Lane without direction or purpose, driven purely by instinct, the instinct to flee. To keep moving before the reality of his situation crushed him in place. The wealthy neighborhood that once symbolized his success now felt hostile, its manicured hedges and pristine driveways serving as a reminder of everything he no longer had access to. Every house he passed seemed to glare at him with polished windows like cold, unblinking eyes. He kept walking faster and faster, until his breath turned ragged and sweat dampened the collar of his shirt. His Italian loafers, designed for cocktail parties and boardrooms, were not built for long distances. The leather dug into his heels, blistering them with each step. Still he pushed forward until the sprawling homes gave way to the quieter streets near Greenwich's small downtown. The shops were opening, bakers setting out trays of pastries, baristas raising metal shutters, commuters rushing toward the train station. Life moved normally for everyone but him. He paused outside a bank, stepping into the vestibule for a moment of shelter. He sank onto the tile floor beneath the exhaustion crashing down on him like a wave. He felt pathetic, reduced, diminished, almost unrecognizable even to himself. Just yesterday, he stood at the center of a high-rise boardroom, commanding financial empires with the ease of a conductor guiding an orchestra. Today, he was sitting on a bank floor, soaked in sweat, dragging a suitcase and a bag of dry cleaning like a drifter. The contrast was nauseating. Mark reached into the dry cleaning bag for his blazer, hoping for something familiar, something that might tether him to sanity. Instead, he found a note from Emma tucked into the inner pocket, along with a prepaid debit card holding $5,000. Even in her thorough dismantling of his life, she had thought ahead enough to keep him from sleeping under a bridge. It wasn't generosity. It was strategy. Enough money to keep him afloat, but not enough to be dangerous. A controlled allowance, nothing more. He crushed the note in his fist and shoved the card into his wallet. $5,000. Yesterday he spent more than that on a dinner for Avery. Today it was his entire net worth. He stared at the in front of him, realizing the irony. A man who once dictated the financial futures of countless clients now had fewer resources than a college intern. His throat tightened as he pushed himself back to his feet and exited the vestibule. He needed a plan, but planning required clarity he didn't have. All he could do was walk. He stepped back into the street, dragging his suitcase, the wheels catching on cracks in the sidewalk. Passersby glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. Normally he carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone who belonged anywhere. Today he looked like a man who didn't belong anywhere at all. After nearly an hour of wandering, he stopped at the corner of Maple and Elm, where an old oak tree cast a stretch of shade across a manicured lawn. He leaned against the trunk, chest heaving, and closed his eyes. But then he heard multiple engines approaching from the direction he came. He opened his eyes and turned just enough to see two black SUVs with tinted windows glide past him, heading toward Blackwater Lane. A police cruiser followed, then another. Mark's pulse spiked. He straightened abruptly, nearly losing his grip on his suitcase. SUVs like those didn't show up in Greenwich unless something serious was happening, or unless someone powerful had summoned them. He stepped out from behind the tree just enough to watch them continue toward his house. One by one, they pulled into his driveway. His heart hammered painfully as the doors opened. First, two uniformed officers stepped out, scanning the area with sharp, professional eyes. Then a sharply dressed man in a gray, tailored suit emerged, Emma's attorney, or at least one of them. And then the rear door of the lead SUV opened. Emma stepped out. She was unrecognizable, not physically, but in presence, confident, composed. Radiating authority, she wore a black power suit, heels that clicked against the pavement, her posture straight and steady. No timidness, no hesitation. Nothing soft or uncertain. This wasn't the Emma who prepared his coffee or laughed politely at his colleagues' jokes. This was Emma Winthrop Dawson, heir to a financial dynasty, majority shareholder of a multi-million-dollar company. A woman who had been underestimated for far too long. Mark's mouth went dry. She glanced up at the house, then at her attorney, discussing something he couldn't hear. Her face was calm, not angry, not emotional, simply resolute. She was reclaiming what belongs to her. The thought sent something volatile erupting inside him. He dropped his bag and started running back toward the house, ignoring the pain slicing through his feet, ignoring the officers turning their heads in alarm. He didn't think, he reacted. He needed to confront her, to demand answers, to reclaim even a shred of dignity. Emma! He shouted, voice cracking, Emma! The officers immediately stepped forward, hands near their holsters. One raised a hand in warning. Sir, stay where you are! But Mark didn't stop. He stopped only when he was 20 or 30 feet from her, breath shaking, sweat dripping down his temples. Emma slowly, deliberately. She removed her sunglasses and met his gaze with a level, composed expression that gutted him more than anger ever could. Don't come any closer, one officer warned. Mark ignored him. You planned this! He yelled, voice splintering under the weight of everything he'd lost. You blindsided me! You set me up! Emma didn't flinch, didn't wince, didn't react like a woman under attack. She merely tilted her head the slightest bit, studying him with a calm, analytical precision he'd never seen from her before. I didn't set you up, she said, voice carrying across the driveway. You set yourself up. I simply documented it. The words sliced through him. He felt heat behind his eyes, a mix of rage and humiliation. I built this life. He shouted, I built company! Emma held his gaze, unwavering. You built part of it, she corrected, but my family funded it. My name protected it. My shares control it. Her attorney stepped forward. Mr. Dawson, you are currently trespassing on property no longer legally under your ownership. I advise you to leave immediately. Mark's face twisted. This is my house! He yelled. Emma shook her head softly. It was our house, she said. But you forfeited your rights to it. Her tone wasn't cruel. That made it worse. Cruelty would have given him something to fight against. Instead, she offered clarity, the one thing he'd avoided his entire life. You wanted freedom, Mark. Freedom from accountability. Freedom to do whatever you wanted, with whomever you wanted. And now you have it, she said, placing her sunglasses back on. Just not in the way you imagined. She turned toward the door. Escort him off the property, she instructed the officers. That was the moment something inside Mark broke, not from anger, but from the unbearable reality that he had lost the war without even knowing a battle had begun. As the officers approached, Mark felt himself step backward instinctively, his throat tightening. Emma, he whispered hoarsely. Please, but she didn't turn, she didn't falter. She simply walked inside her house, closing the door behind her with the finality of a judge's gavel. And for the first time in his adult life, Mark Dawson realized that nobody, not his mistress, not his partner, not his money, was coming to save him. Not now, not ever, and he was finally completely, terrifyingly on his own. By the time the officers escorted Mark off what used to be his property, something inside him had shifted. The panic that overwhelmed him earlier burned away, replaced by a harder, darker instinct rage. Not the explosive type, it was quieter, colder, coiling in his chest like a newly awakened creature. Emma had taken everything. She'd cleaned out their home, emptied his accounts, exposed his financial missteps, executed a hostile takeover of the company he believed he co-built, turned his colleagues against him, and stripped him of every advantage he once enjoyed. She didn't just leave him, she erased him. And now she wanted him gallant, compliant. But Mark Dawson wasn't going to disappear. He refused to go down without throwing a match into her pristine empire. If she wanted a war, he would give her a battlefield. He dragged his suitcase through town and found a dingy internet cafe tucked beside a pawn shop. A place so foreign to his world of corner offices and white glove service that stepping inside felt like a personal humiliation. But humiliation was fuel now. He paid for an hour of computer time using part of the prepaid card Emma left him, an act that only heightened his fury. He wouldn't use that card to survive, he would use it to strike back, and he knew exactly how. He had always been the numbers guy, the architect behind the company's financial structure, offshore accounts, shell companies, tax shelters hidden inside more tax shelters, complex routing systems that only a handful of people understood, and he understood them better than anyone. If Emma wanted to portray herself as the righteous savior of Dawson a Harlow, he would rip off the mask and expose the rot he believed she depended on. He opened a blank email and typed out the address of the ER's whistleblower office. Then, emboldened, he added the address of the New York Times Financial Investigations team. For the next 3 hours, he poured everything onto the screen: offshore trusts registered in the British Virgin Islands, shell corporations with sanitized names like Redwood International and Silvercrest Ventures, payout funnels labeled as consulting fees, expense categories that served as bridges for taxable income to become untaxed foreign holdings. He listed account numbers from memory, cited internal ledger codes, and attached spreadsheets he'd secretly backed up months earlier. Each keystroke felt like reclaiming power Emma had ripped away. If he brought this empire down, she would feel it. She would lose everything she fought to control. And the beauty of he believed was that whistleblowers were protected, rewarded. He imagined a future in which the government praised him for courage, where Emma stood in front of flashing cameras trying to justify why a majority shareholder oversaw a company rife with tax evasion. He pictured headliners here to Winthrop Fortune implicated in corporate fraud. He pictured her empire burning. The fantasy drove him forward. By the time he finished, his fingers shook with adrenaline. He hit send, watched the emails fire off, and leaned back with a twisted smile spreading across his face. "Your move, Emma," he murmured. Vengeance felt intoxicating. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt like he had leverage again. Like he wasn't just a man being dismantled, he was a man fighting back. He bought a cheap beer from the vending machine with the last of his small bills and sat on the motel bed hours later, drinking to the thought of Emma's panic when the news broke. He imagined the board scrambling, the attorneys fumbling, the ears knocking on her door at dawn. He drifted into the first real sleep he'd had since returning home, lulled by the illusion that he had finally regained control. He woke late the next morning to sunlight leaking through the torn curtains. His phone charged on the motel's flimsy nightstand buzzed with new emails. His heart kicked with anticipation as he opened the inbox. One message stood out from New York Times Financial Investigations desk. Subject: urgent tip, Dawson and Harlow offshore structure. His pulse quickened. This was it. He opened the email, and instantly his stomach plummeted. The message was brief, clinical, devastating. "Thank you for your submission. We will not be pursuing this story. The financial structures you describe were publicly disclosed 3 days ago at a press conference led by Emma Winthrop Dawson. The company has already initiated a voluntary audit with the ERs and reached a preliminary settlement citing mismanagement by former executive leadership. The documents you provided appear to be proprietary and may violate corporate confidentiality statutes. We advise you to consult legal counsel. We will not contact you further." Mark stared at the screen, reading the words again and again, unable to process them. Publicly disclosed. Voluntary audit, settlement reached, former executive leadership. She beat him to it. She had gone to the ears before he even had the chance to weaponize the information. She'd framed the narrative perfectly, a powerful new CEO uncovering financial irregularities caused by a corrupt foe. She didn't wait for him to attack, she launched first and claimed the moral high ground. And worst of all, his email wasn't whistleblowing, it was confession. Detailed, documented, self-incriminating confession. A fresh horror washed over him as the final sentence from the Times echoed in his mind. "The documents you provided appear to be proprietary and may violate corporate confidentiality statutes." He had handed the government and the press proof of his involvement in financial misconduct. He had exposed himself, not her. He felt the edges of the motel room close in as panic surged through him. His breathing quickened. He tried to tell himself he could still explain it away. He could still claim he was cooperating. He could still salvage something. But then 3 loud, unmistakable knocks rattled the motel door. Not housekeeping, not staff, something heavier. Federal agents, a deep voice called. Open the door. Mark's blood turned to ice. He staggered backward, hands trembling, staring at the door as if it were a predator. Mark Dawson, the voice continued, firm, unyielding. We have a warrant for your arrest. His legs buckled. This wasn't Emma's doing. This wasn't Avery's betrayal. This wasn't David's caution. This was the U.S. government responding to the evidence he himself had handed them. He had built the news. Emma merely stepped aside and let him tighten it. And as the door burst open and agents entered with practiced efficiency, Mark Dawson finally understood the brutal truth. Emma didn't just win. She ended the war before he even realized he'd started one. He thought he was lighting a match. He was standing in a room she'd already flooded with gasoline. 5 years inside a federal correctional facility didn't just age Mark Dawson, they hollowed him out. The man who once strutted across marble lobbies and negotiated multi-million-dollar deals now shuffled under fluorescent lights carrying trays of institutional food. The steel gray jumpsuit hung loosely on a body that had lost its former confidence, his hair thinned at the temples, and the self-assured smirk he once wore like armor had crumbled into a permanent sag around his jawline. He was inmate 49221, a number recited at roll call, printed on his uniform, stamped on every document tied to his existence. In a place where numbers replaced names, prestige dissolved fast. No one cared who he had been. No one cared about his corner office or his Porsche or the Manhattan hotels where he'd once felt invincible. His past didn't buy him protection, privilege, or even respect. It bought him silence from the guards and indifference from fellow inmates who'd seen far worse men walk these halls. For the first year, he raged internally, convinced everything was temporary, convinced the world outside would somehow realize he'd been wronged, convinced Emma would eventually extend mercy. But mercy never came, appeals failed, lawyers quit, life moved on without him, and Mark stopped waiting. He settled into the monotonous rhythm of prison life, mornings in the cafeteria, afternoons in the workshop, evenings shelving books in the small prison library. Ironically, the library assignment was what kept him from unraveling. Among the torn paperbacks and outdated magazines, he found something like structure, order, a purpose that didn't depend on wealth or influence. He repaired damaged bindings, sorted returns, wiped down tables. Tasks that once would have insulted him became the only things grounding him. Sometimes he wondered if this was the closest he'd ever come to understanding Emma's father, the quiet archivist he once mocked in his mind for being small. Now he saw the truth. Small didn't mean weak. It meant patient. It meant steady. It meant knowing value didn't always need to be shouted. As the years passed, the rage drained out of him, replaced by something heavier, reflection. He replayed every choice that led him here, recognizing patterns he once refused to see, the arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that he was untouchable. He realized he hadn't lost everything because Emma destroyed him. He lost everything because he thought he could live multiple lives without consequences. He thought he could take without giving. He thought he could cheat without being caught. Prison forced him to face himself without distraction or escape routes. And what he saw wasn't a victim, it was a man who believed he was the main character in every room, blind to the fact that other people had lives' limits and lines they would eventually draw. He knew now Emma hadn't been weak, she'd been waiting. She'd given him chance after chance, and when he pushed 1 inch too far, she closed the book on him permanently. 6 months before release, when he'd grown used to obscurity, a young inmate named Leo, thin, restless, quick with nervous jokes, sat across from him at lunch with a contraband tablet. "Hey Mark," he whispered, sliding into the seat. "Isn't this your ex?" Mark looked up slowly, uninterested at first. His past life rarely intruded anymore. But when Leo turned the screen toward him, Mark's breath hitched. On the tablet was a video from Bloomberg Technology. A headline stretched across the bottom: Winthrop Urban Group unveils $1 billion green city project in Austin. Standing at the podium was Emma. Not the Emma who used to pack his suitcase or schedule dentist appointments. This Emma commanded a room. She wore a pristine white suit that caught the lights perfectly, her posture straight, her movements measured, her expression sharp with intelligence and purpose. She looked 10 years younger and infinitely more powerful. A futuristic architectural model stood beside her as she explained the company's bold new initiative, her voice steady, confident, visionary. She wasn't surviving without him. She was thriving, flourishing, becoming everything he once kept her from becoming. And beside her, stepping forward with a supportive hand at her back, was David Harlow, his former business partner. Tall, composed, a hint of silver at the temples, wearing the kind of genuine smile Mark had never seen from him. The look David and Emma exchanged, respectful, warm, effortless, made Mark's chest tighten dangerously. Leo whistled low. "Damn," he murmured. "She kept the company and took your partner. That's cold," but the words barely registered. Mark was locked on the screen, on the woman who no longer carried his last name, Mies. "Winthrop," the reporter asked her in the clip, "your company is expected to generate over $1 billion in revenue from this Austin project. How did you rebuild so quickly after the scandal 5 years ago?" Emma smiled, graceful and devoid of bitterness. "Honesty," she answered simply. "We cut out what was holding us back. We refocused on long-term purpose instead of short-term gains. And I surrounded myself with a team who believed in the vision." She glanced at David, a look of deep gratitude passing between them. Then she added a final sentence that landed like a hammer blows sometimes to rise. "You have to let go of what was weighing you down." She never said his name. She didn't need to. She wasn't angry at him. She wasn't hurt by him. She wasn't even interested in condemning him. She had moved on long before he ever stepped foot in prison. He wasn't a villain in her story. He wasn't even a memory worth naming. He was an obstacle she removed. A chapter she closed, a mistake she didn't plan to repeat. Leo pulled the tablet back and shook his head. "Brutal," he muttered. "She didn't even drop your name." But Mark didn't respond. He stared at his meatloaf, the cheap plastic fork trembling slightly in his aging hand. Something inside him cracked, not with anger, but with a quiet acceptance that flooded him with a new kind of grief. He had spent his entire life chasing importance, convincing himself he mattered more than he did. He cheated because he wanted to feel desired. He manipulated because he wanted to feel powerful. He lied because he wanted to shape the world around him. And now, he didn't matter at all, not to Emma, not to Avery, not to David, the company, not to anyone outside these walls. He was a footnote in a story that no one needed to reread, a cautionary tale, not a tragedy, a warning, not a legacy. And for a man who once believed he controlled everything, irrelevance was the harshest punishment of all. When the bell rang for the end of lunch, Mark stood slowly, dumped his tray, and filed into line to be counted. The guards called numbers 42 to 1 included, ensuring each man was accounted for. Mark obeyed, moving with the steady, resigned pace of someone who no longer fought the inevitable. As he walked back to his cell, he didn't think of revenge. He didn't think of escape. He didn't think of the life he lost or the life Emma gained. He thought only of the truth that had become impossible to ignore. She hadn't destroyed him. She had simply removed him from a place he never deserved to occupy. And now, in a gray cell with a thin mattress and a steel door, Mark Dawson understood the final consequence of his choices, not the prison sentence, not the scandals, not the money he lost. The true punishment was this crushing realization: the world was better without him, and it no longer remembered he existed. The story of Mark Dawson isn't just a tale about infidelity or corporate downfall. It is a profound, multi-layered lesson about hubris, blindness, and the devastating costs of assuming the world will always bend in your favor. At its core, the narrative exposes one timeless truth: when someone builds their life on illusions, shortcuts, and selfishness, the collapse isn't sudden, it is inevitable. Mark believed he was too intelligent to be caught, too essential to be replaced, too powerful to be questioned. And because of that belief, he ignored every warning sign, every ethical boundary, every opportunity to change course. The first lesson the story teaches is that arrogance blinds more effectively than darkness. A person convinced of their own invincibility will fail to see the cracks beneath their feet, even as those cracks widen into the pit they eventually fall into. Mark didn't lose everything because Emma outsmarted him. He lost everything because he never imagined she could. Another lesson woven through the narrative is the difference between strength and quiet strength. Mark interpreted Emma's calm demeanor, her lack of confrontation, her gentle ways, as signs of weakness. He mistook humility for submission, patience for passivity, forgiveness for fragility. What he never understood until it was too late is that quiet people often hold the deepest power. Emma's strength wasn't loud. It was strategic. She wasn't impulsive, she was methodical. She didn't scream, argue, or beg. She prepared, documented, protected, and acted. In a world that often rewards noise and bravado, her power came from discipline, foresight, and restraint. The story teaches that underestimating those who don't flaunt their power is one of the most catastrophic mistakes a person can make. Real strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it plans its exit in silence and lets consequences do the talking. There is also a critical lesson about the illusion of control. Mark believed he controlled his marriage, his mistress, his company, his finances, even the narrative of his own life. He treated people like pieces in a game he had already won. But control built on deception is fragile, and once the truth pierces it, everything collapses at once. Emma didn't take his power, she simply revealed that he never truly had any. His authority at the company existed because she allowed it. His wealth existed because of her family's investment. His lifestyle existed because she provided stability. The moment she withdrew the foundation, the entire structure fell. The story reminds us that if your identity depends on external symbols, money, status, titles rather than character and integrity, then your sense of control is nothing more than a house built on sand. The narrative also delivers a deeply moral lesson about loyalty and the consequences of betrayal. Mark believed loyalty was optional, negotiable, something he could demand but didn't need to give. His affair with Avery, his financial manipulation, and his lies revealed how little he valued the people around him. Yet when his world imploded, he expected those same people to offer unwavering support. Avery's abandonment was not simply a failure of loyalty, it was a reflection of the transactional relationships Mark created. You cannot expect loyalty from people who were only ever valued for convenience. The story illustrates that the loyalty we receive in life is often a mirror of the loyalty we give. When Mark treated relationships as disposable, he unknowingly wrote his own fate when he needed people most. They disposed of him with the same ease he once used on others. Another important lesson is the danger of ignoring consequences. Mark didn't fall because of a single bad decision, he fell because of a long series of choices he refused to examine. A hidden expense report, a secret credit card, a weekend in Manhattan disguised as a business trip, each choice felt small, manageable, invisible. But consequences compound quietly, and one day they demand payment all at once. The story emphasizes that misconduct rarely destroys someone in the moment, it destroys them when the accumulation becomes too heavy to hide. Emma didn't catch Mark by luck, she caught him because his own patterns caught up to him. The downfall didn't happen in a day, it happened inch by inch, lie by lie, choice by choice. The lesson: you cannot outrun your actions. They will always find you, often at the worst possible moment. The final and perhaps deepest lesson of the story lies in the theme of irrelevance. Prison didn't break Mark. Losing his money didn't break Mark. Watching Emma succeed didn't break Mark. What broke him was the realization that the world continued without him and did so better. For a man who built his identity on importance, influence, being the center of everything, irrelevance was the true punishment. Emma didn't destroy him to hurt him. She removed him because he no longer added anything valuable to her life. And in the end, that realization struck harder than any legal sentence could. The story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: our value in the lives of others is not guaranteed. It must be earned, nurtured, protected. When we take people for granted, when we treat relationships like resources, when we assume others will tolerate our flaws indefinitely, we risk discovering that the world will not just move on, it will flourish in our absence. Taken together, the lessons of Mark Dawson's story form a powerful message about responsibility, perception, humility, and integrity. It warns us to never underestimate quiet strength, to never confuse privilege for invulnerability, and to never take the people who support us for granted. It reminds us that betrayal doesn't only destroy relationships, it destroys the betrayer. And it shows that the greatest downfall isn't losing wealth or status, but realizing those things never made you valuable in the first place. What defines a person, in the end, is not how high they climb, but how they treat the people who help them climb, and whether the world is better or worse for having them in it. Mark's tragedy is not that he fell, it's that he never understood why he fell. And Emma's triumph is not that she rose higher, it's that she did so by finally removing the weight that was holding her down.
If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming videos. If you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd really love to hear your feedback. Thank you for watching until the end.